Sometimes when we read a work, there comes a moment when it shifts into a completely different dimension. It could be a scene, a dialogue, an image, or even a narrative arc, thanks to which, without realizing it, our reading changes radically. Anyway, I'm not going to give you the same intro as I did for the Hunter x Hunter video, because I think you figured out where I'm going with the title alone. We're going to talk about Vinland Saga's farm arc, and how this arc propels the manga to masterpiece status in my eyes. As I write this video, the season 2 of the anime adaptation has just finished, and if you look at the feedback we've received throughout its broadcast, you'll see that a good proportion of people who've only seen season 1 have rather mixed opinions. Like, there's no more fighting, it's boring, and where's my real Thorfinn, where's my Viking story, and so on. The famous fight fanboy, as I like to call them. Honestly, I was kind of expecting this kind of comment, but I was hoping it would be in the minority. In any case, it's partly in response to these disastrous opinions, but also to share with you what I understood about this arc that I'm offering you this video. To explain not only why I find it exceptional, but also how everything you saw in season 1 was only written to lead up to this arc. And that without it, all the above wouldn't really make sense. In short, we're going to push some open doors and see how Makoto Yukimura manipulated us to get his pacifist message across through a manga that was being sold as a story of revenge, and how this message is all the more impactful when it's understood and then carried by the main character himself through his questioning and his awareness, which will echo to the reader himself. Oh, and the video will only spoil up to the end of the arc, so up to the end of season 2 for those who've only seen the anime. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and all that if you liked the video, so I don't have to repeat it at the end, and so I can make a stylish conclusion. But let's start from the beginning. Vinland Saga tries to deceive us right from the first chapter by making us believe in a story of revenge. Yes, for the record, the anime begins with Thorfinn's childhood and the death of his father, but in the manga, this passage is a flashback that comes after a long introduction to Thorfinn's desire for revenge against Askeladd, rather like the beginning of Berserk. We don't see Thor's death until the end of volume 2, and so, following this flashback, we know that Thorfinn wants to avenge his father's death by killing Askeladd in a duel. And this is important to note. He doesn't just want to see him dead, he wants to kill him in a real duel. Because if his father is dead, it's because Askeladd didn't respect the rules of their duel, otherwise Thor's would have won. In short, we're really talking about symbolic revenge, and that's why Askeladd won't have to worry about Thorfinn killing him in his sleep, and will be able to use him for many years to come. The problem is, if you stay close to someone for more than 10 years, from childhood to adolescence, it's hard not to become attached to them. Even more so when that person serves indirectly as a mentor. Even more so when you no longer have a father figure to hold on to. And therein lies Thorfinn's paradox. He may have hated Askeladd, but deep down, Askeladd had become, without his realizing it, like a father to him. And of course, this is one of the reasons why Askeladd's death will shake him to the core and leave him completely lost. But that's not necessarily what I'm going to focus on here. For me, the most important thing to take away from what precedes the farm arc is the way hatred banalizes violence in Thorfinn. As does the fact that setting a tale of revenge in a fantasized place and time like the Vikings banalizes and legitimizes that same violence in the eyes of the reader. Thorfinn grows up in a world of violence, and killing becomes normal for him. He slits throats like a morning jogger, and this discrepancy between him and normal people is superbly staged as early as volume 3, where we see Thorfinn kill a guy as if nothing had happened and talk to the woman who had taken him in, without even understanding the full significance of what he's just done, or why the woman is crying after witnessing it. And indeed, the real reason behind his tears is not fear or guilt at having cared for a monster like him, but sadness at seeing a child so alienated by the environment in which he lives. But Thorfinn is not alone in this. It's the case for us too, as readers. In fact, in fiction in general, death is a banal thing, a trope so overused that most people are less shocked by a guy getting decapitated than by a sex scene, for example. We've all become accustomed to a certain violence in our works. And violence is at the heart of stories of revenge or war, where it is often fantasized, aestheticized, exciting, even fun. Viking stories alone crystallize all this, with their fantasized image of badass warriors going to war with smiles on their faces, all too happy to die with axe in hand to enter Valhall, or to live for the thrill of battle. Thorkel in Vinland Saga is the perfect example, a funny, violent character who lives for war, and when he's bored, smashes bears with his bare hands for breakfast. But historically speaking, Vikings weren't really like that. We have a distorted and fantasized vision of the Viking world. In fact, it's simple. There is no such thing as a Viking people. If the name has entered into common usage, the peoples of Scandinavia have never called themselves Viking. This Old Norse term was reserved for men who took part in a maritime expedition, whether military or commercial. And since this is what the majority of European kingdoms saw, most of whose sources come from the writings of monks threatened by raids on their isolated abbeys, the word stuck. But it's still a misnomer to describe the Scandinavians, who in the Middle Ages formed a mosaic of different peoples and kingdoms. The vision of the gruff, violent Viking thirsty for blood and plunder is a historical construct originating in medieval sources, then transformed in the 19th century with the fascination of Romanticism for Norse history and mythology, followed by nationalist movements seeking prestigious roots to exalt an ideal of strength and virility. The Viking alone encapsulates the two opposing facets of the representation of the barbarian. On the one hand, we have the image of the bloodthirsty warrior bringing destruction and darkness to civilization. On the other, he embodies the virile fantasy of a warrior heroism in which strength, sacrifice and courage are authentic values that have not been perverted by the softness of polite civilizations, which makes for fine folk roots when you want to claim prestigious ancestors to distinguish yourself from other peoples or from Christian culture. This has been the case for many nationalist and supremacist movements, highlighting the paganism of their origins. But these are all fantasies, rereadings and distorted representations that have little to do with reality, and are often linked to the political and ideological desire to reconstruct a Viking history. But in any case, as a viewer, we like it because there's something very entertaining about seeing a guy fight furiously and kill lots of random people, especially as the more people we see killed without it being treated dramatically, the more we'll get used to murder, as if it wasn't as bad as all that. And I'm not trying to moralize here. It's perfectly logical to find it entertaining, especially as the people who get killed are very often dehumanized. Like, who's going to care about generic, nameless, backstoryless extras who serve as cannon fodder for the protagonists, especially since they die cleanly? We're not going to see them agonize, weeping, screaming in pain and pissing themselves for long minutes. They die a bit like mobs in a video game. In short, in this kind of story, the death of the one who will simply be categorized as the enemy very often has a purely cathartic function and thus becomes almost pleasurable to watch. And what's interesting in my view is that Makoto Yukimura, fully aware of this fantasized Viking universe and the habituation to violence that this kind of story entails, uses this whole narrative construction to put us to sleep a little from a moral point of view and bind us to his character Thorfinn, for whom the battlefield is also a real outlet. In the first part, which is really just a prologue, there are big fights, it's fun. Thorkel is so badass he fights with a tree trunk. He's so stylish that he swings that same tree trunk 40 meters at boats. Askeladd is the epitome of flow, and then there's Thorfinn, who fights with 2 daggers. He's so stylish, he single-handedly smashes through troops and so on. It's a thrilling, exhilarating war epic until all hell breaks loose. Thorfinn, like the viewer, has completely forgotten that killing, well, it's not good. That in front of him, there are no enemies, but human beings like him or his father, who want to live. And Yukimura uses all this to wake us up with a slap in the face and bring us, as well as Thorfinn, back to reality with a brutal change of tone through the farm arc, in order to provoke a real awakening and get his pacifist message across in a very striking way, by deconstructing everything that made the prologue so good and exposing its underlying mechanics. The farm arc is a very brutal turning point in the manga. We go from fantasized medieval battlefields with completely unrealistic fights, because yeah, when Thorkel snipes people at 300 meters with a javelin throw, it's not really very realistic, to a farmer's life in a wheat field, much more credible, much closer to what daily life was really like for most people of the time. It's as if Yukimura came to wake us up and said, yeah, it's nice to idealize conquerors and bloodthirsty killers, but in the meantime, real life is here, with these people, and your stupid wars are bothering everyone. And it's all the more striking that one of the major stakes of this arc will come from the character who has taken over from Thorfinn by embracing the violence he rejected before, not, but more on that later. By his own admission, Yukimura says in an interview that he has few sources translated into Japanese concerning the Vikings. So, as we've said, everything that roughly corresponds to season 1 of the anime is a concentration of cliches about Vikings, but it's all the better to deconstruct them in the farm arc, where despite the preservation, whether intentional or not, of certain fictional tropes, we get a glimpse of another, often forgotten facet of the Scandinavian world. Because beyond the expeditions that made them famous, bringing a Norse presence to almost every corner of Europe, from the Batarik to the Mediterranean, via Greece and the banks of the Volga, and this most often for commercial reasons, agriculture was one of the strong points of Scandinavian culture. Wherever the land was fertile, particularly well-organized farms were found, demonstrating a high level of mastery in terms of agricultural techniques, and this had been the case since late antiquity. Ketil's farm was one of these vast estates, organized around a family head, where both free men and slaves could be found. Well, we'll skip over the fact that in Vinland Saga, wheat is grown, even though it was a rare cereal, and the dominant crops were rye, barley and oats. But let's not quibble. The main idea is that it's no coincidence that, in an arc that aims to deconstruct a fantasy of virile warrior heroism, embodied in the very essence of Viking representation, we are highlighting this often overlooked yet essential facet of Norse culture. Especially as it shows that not all Norsemen are warriors, and that they represent only a small proportion of the population. This is ultimately why, later in the arc, a character like Thorgil comes across as quirky, frightening, and brutal. The farm arc sounds like a violent return to reality, hence its much more realistic setting. And we put realistic in quotation marks, because we mustn't lose sight of what Vinland Saga is: fiction. Despite the research he's done, it's not a historical documentary on Viking life, and Yukimura is perfectly aware of this. That's why he doesn't hesitate to take liberties with real history and the fate of the characters. His manga is not a medieval work but a medievalist work. That is a fictional work rooted in the Middle Ages, reconstructed for the needs of fiction, with all its share of errors and inaccuracies. But we don't care about that, as long as we don't forget it's fiction. That's why Vinland Saga is a far more honest manga than Viking, whose first season was partly promoted on the promise of historical accuracy. This is of course not the case, whatever its director may say. Too many people confuse Viking medievalist fiction with historical reality, which explains so much confusion and fantasy. And that makes Vinland Saga's message all the more powerful because it goes against the grain of what we're used to seeing. And it's within this context that we find Thorfinn broken inside. His life no longer has any meaning. He's lost the only thing that kept him going: his desire for vengeance. Without hatred, he's empty. Doubt sets in. He who had clung desperately to his desire for vengeance, did he still feel hatred for Askeladd, who had become by force of circumstance a surrogate father? Before he died, Askeladd said his last words to him: "Become a true warrior, son of Thor," in the words of Thor himself. In short, he's completely lost, and in the end gradually realizes that his whole quest was in vain. And in retrospect, he realizes that his life was absurd, that it never did him any good, that he is an empty shell who knows only war, a destroyer and bringer of death. Every night he is haunted by the nightmare of his crimes and the ghosts of his victims. Why did he do it? Why did he kill? Why this violence? What's the point? He's so weary that he wants to die without being able to do it. But that's until Serpent makes him realize that deep down, he can't bring himself to do it. His body wants to live. This is one of the things he has in common with Guts, from Berserk, whom I like very much, and who I talked about at length in the video dedicated to him, in the sense that they both don't understand why they want to live. Why at the last moment, when they think they're resigned, something deep inside them makes them fight to stay alive. The farm arc is the reconstruction of a destroyed Thorfinn reduced to a hollow shell, or rather, it's the moment when Thorfinn finally decides to live. This involves the introduction of a new character who becomes central to the Vinland Saga story, Einar. Einar is a victim of warriors like Thorfinn, who massacred his family, leading him to develop a visceral hatred of them. For him, a peasant who farms and builds, warriors are bloodthirsty monsters who know only how to destroy and bring death. He's genuinely confused when he learns that Thorfinn is one of them, because he doesn't resemble, or no longer resembles, to the representation he had made of them. This feeling is heightened when he learns Thorfinn's reasons for acting as he did, for they are ultimately quite similar. He hated the warriors who killed his father and wanted revenge. The only difference between them is that they didn't react in the same way, perhaps because Einar was already older and therefore more aware of the danger, knowing that he was unable to fight them, whereas Thorfinn, as a child, had no real capacity for discernment. Einar comes to realize this closeness to Thorfinn when he hesitates to kill him in his sleep. He's just like those who mercilessly slaughtered his family and burned down his village. And the adaptation doesn't hesitate to deepen Einar's drama by showing us this scene head-on from the very first minutes of Season 2, accentuating the horror and empathy while clearly presenting its note of intent. We return to the story of Vinland Saga through the eyes of a life shattered by the warlike brutality that took everything from him. The story is not that of a fearsome Viking warrior, but that of a victim of war brutality. The scene where he hesitates to kill Thorfinn will also be quite different in the anime, where he actually strangles him, then stops before it's too late. By strangling him in this way, he takes the first step towards those he was supposed to hate in the first place. The problem of violence doesn't come from individual men, because anyone can fall into this absurd violence if they find themselves caught up in the right circumstances. No, the problem is global, systemic, and one man alone can't really fight it. The relationship between Thorfinn and Einar is at the heart of the arc. Einar will teach a lot to Thorfinn, who has never really lived. First of all, he'll learn about friendship, something he's never known since he's always been hostile towards his companions, who in return were either mocking, indifferent, or cynical. Through this friendship, he learns about kindness, the value of helping others, cooperation, and so on. In short, he'll learn to socialize a little. The brutal, solitary beast becomes a political animal. Einar teaches him how to farm, which is symbolically powerful because it's the first time Thorfinn creates something, having never done anything but destroy. From being the bearer of death, he becomes the sower of life. He will see his field grow, he will see life emerge little by little from the soil, grow, develop, and marvel at it all. Simple things, yet beautiful things. Einar sums it up by comparing him to a newborn baby, and that's literally what Thorfinn is experiencing, a second birth. In fact, there's a passage I really like when he admires the ingenuity of the plough, the fact that one day, a guy had the idea of inventing it, improving the lives of thousands of peasants, unlike him, who has never been useful by waging war. And if I like this passage a lot, it's also because it echoes the story of a brilliant character we meet later in the story, but I'd rather not spoil it for you. Those of you who have read, when Thorfinn discovers all this, he wonders if it's possible for him to change, if men in general can change. And I love the part where the old man tells him after hearing him tell Einar that without hatred he was empty, that the advantage of an empty vessel is that you can put whatever you want in it, as a kind of answer to this question about change. But Thorfinn's change is very gradual, and takes shape when the farm workers ruin his wheat field. At first, Thorfinn doesn't seek revenge. He has no right to do so, after all. He's one of those who destroy. He has no right to complain about someone doing to him what he himself has done to others. But when confronted with them, he breaks down, fights back, takes a beating and plunges into unconsciousness. There he relapses into the nightmare he has every night. But this time, he remembers. First of all, he remembers the words his father had given him when he was 6 years old, which he had long since forgotten. You have no enemies. Nobody has enemies. He realizes that in the end, wanting to avenge his father only led him to act in a way diametrically opposed to what he would have wanted, that it was ultimately the worst choice, and that there's clearly no turning back. In this dreamlike hell, the specters of Thorfinn's victims carry him away, pulling him down into the depths, to punish him, to tell him that he has caused so much suffering that he has no right to change, that he must stay in the hell he once so nourished. And Thorfinn seems determined to accept it, aware of all the evil he has done. He thinks he deserves it and doesn't know what else to do but apologize and accept his sentence. Salvation comes from the shadow of his second father, Askeladd, who appears to him. Does he, who has the chance to live, really want to stay with all these warriors in this hellhole populated by the dead who kill each other and have lived only by violence? Thorfinn's resolve grows stronger, as does his desire to live. He must fight again and again, carrying with him all the death he has caused. He cannot rid himself of his crimes by wiping the slate clean. What's done is done. But he must take them on and carry them with him. And so begins the hardest struggle of all, that of renouncing violence and becoming a true warrior, just as his real father was, although he doesn't yet know what that is. After this, Thorfinn expresses his determination to renounce all forms of violence once and for all, but he still needs to find a goal, a place where the ghosts of his victims can finally rest in peace. At the same time, Knut plays the conqueror, organizing assassinations, waging war, etc., in pursuit of his ideal of making the world a paradise on earth by literally becoming its king. He will try to make wars less bloody, but even if it's a little less bad, it's still horrible. For example, he forbids his soldiers to massacre, pillage and so on, but they won't respect his orders, to which he responds by having them executed. Violence against violence. And it doesn't work, of course it doesn't work. There's no such thing as a clean war. Any conquest by force is horrible. All Knut can hope for is that, after all the suffering his war has caused, he'll have won, and the world will be at peace. But for that to happen, he has to hope that the same war doesn't create more monsters like Thorfinn, which is an extremely naive vision. However, Knut really believes in his idea, and thinks he can make people happier this way. His vision of morality is diametrically opposed to Thorfinn's, but we'll talk more about that later. The story makes a time skip, and we see the moment coming when Thorfinn and Einar will soon be free, and must ask themselves what they'll do once they're freed. Knut, on the other hand, having poisoned his brother, wants to take over Ketil's farm for his own use, because, well, war is cool, but it's expensive, and he's going to create a whole plot, as he's used to take it over legitimately, between big quotation marks, which will quickly lead to an escalation of violence. Generally speaking, violence comes from just about every stratum of society, through the men of power, with Knut, to satisfy his ambitions, with Ketil, the master of the domain, who, despite his appearance as a benevolent and just master, descends totally into violence when everything he owns seems to be slipping away from him, the definitive turning point coming with Arnid's attempted escape. The same is true of the men-at-arms, from the Jomsvikings to the company of mercenaries protecting the farm. For these men who live for violence, it is both a form of pleasure and power, entertainment to pass the time, or the promise of a desired Valhall. And sometimes it's just boredom, to kill time, as Badger and Fox decide to go after Thorfinn for their own amusement. We have some of Ketil's employees, free men, who take pleasure in bullying the only ones below them, the slaves, out of resentment, and surely to release their frustration at being dominated by the powerful. And finally, the slaves themselves, through Arnice's husband, who has completely lost it because of the treatment his master has meted out to him, and goes on to slaughter him and the rest of his family. By showing us a violence present in every stratum of society, finding its cause mainly in the interactions between those very strata, I can't help but see in it a message from Yukimura denouncing the very principle of domination, of hierarchization between individuals, as if violence were partly rooted in it. He doesn't just say that violence is bad, or give a moralistic message about violence. He shows all the mechanisms, causes and effects. Gardar's explosion, however terrible and barbaric it may seem, appears as a return of violence from the oppressed to the oppressor. The insidious violence of the employees, as the product of frustration caused by an unequal social order exploiting those without property. The warrior's violence stems from the exaltation of a way of life in which brutality is seen as a legitimate means of exercising power over others and a gateway to eternity. In essence, the triumph of a warrior virility, where honor, power and pride lie in the ability to spill blood. To be a man is to embrace warrior violence as a virtue. For men without honor, like the mercenaries of the Serpent Gang, it's both the only language and the only occupation they have. And finally, there's Knut, the Machiavellian head of state who sees it as a necessary recourse to achieve his ideal of peace. Violence is everywhere, in every stratum of society, crushing the innocent, destroying or gnawing at those who use it. It is no longer shown with complacency, as is usually the case in stories featuring the Viking world. It's not fun, joyful or exhilarating. Violence is no longer epic. It's a scourge that crushes individuals, destroys the innocent, gnaws at those who use it and end up its victims. That's why both the anime and the manga focus on those who suffer, especially the innocent, the true victims of a ruthless, warlike world. The plot of Arnice's husband is a good example of the violence inherent in this hierarchical society. First of all, he became a slave because he went to war over iron resources, in keeping with this logic of competition between individuals, so that some rise above the others, when we could very well have imagined that they would share the resources, especially when we know that his village already had enough iron to live on. After that, he sank into madness, a madness similar to Thorfinn's, since it seems totally justified in view of his experience. I really think this part of the arc is brilliant from Einar's point of view. He's been in love with Arnice for a while, but learns in one fell swoop that she's carrying Ketil's child, and that her completely insane husband, whom she still loves, is coming to save her. Despite the fact that he knows his love is impossible, he'll still want to help her, but doesn't even know what to do because no choice can be right. And it all ends in the worst possible way, with the death of her husband, followed by the death of Arnice, who is beaten to death by Ketil for daring to forget her status as a slave and try to regain her freedom. To illustrate the idea of this violence as a backdrop to the world, the anime decided to make a very symbolic and powerful addition. While Arnice is immersed in a state between life and death, she has a vision of Gardar. In her exchange with him, she compares this world to a forest, and this is particularly interesting. The forest is a common allegory of a state of war, where the law of the strongest reigns and no one is safe. By a state of war, we don't mean war itself, but its presence, which weighs on absolutely everything and everyone. Everything is made, thought out and structured by the possibility of war, seen as the permanent emergence of violence. Einar paid the price when he saw his village pillaged and his family massacred. Warriors are like wild beasts seeking prey, feasting on the blood of those too weak to defend themselves. In political philosophy, we traditionally associate the state of nature with the state of war, with the rather cliched sentence, "Man is a wolf to man," improperly attributed to Thomas Hobbes. But here, we are shown not a state of nature, but a state of civilization with no power to enforce peace. Sovereigns are too weak, too destitute, or too greedy to ensure the security of their people. Everything is a balance of power between entities. Between Ketil and Knut, between the village of Gardar and the rival community, or Einar's village and the Norse. The forest is a world of violence where only strength counts. And yet, the forest is ambivalent, for it is also where man can find himself. It is also a space of freedom where everything can be built. The forest is not the illustration of man's violent nature, but the allegory of a lawless world at the mercy of predators, where anything is possible. Hence the image of these two magnificent animals in Arnice's vision, a wolf, Thorfinn, and a deer, Einar. Life is still present in this forest, which becomes, through its lawlessness, the place of all possibilities. It's not man's nature that's at fault, contrary to what the most pessimistic would say, but the fault of a society corrupted by its illusions, fantasies, and unhealthy desires. It's in the forest that Thorfinn rediscovers his humanity, through work on the land and contact with nature, which he learns to tame. And it's in this forest that all possibilities lie, from which something new can be rebuilt. This whole plot is in a way the starting point for Thorfinn's wider reflections. He has personally renounced violence, but then wonders about the possibility of a world where violence no longer exists, where the world changes as he has changed himself. Because after all the evil he has done, the death he has sown, changing is not enough to make up for his mistakes. He has to go further, make up for all the evil he has done by doing good. He therefore dreams of a world without war or slavery, because having lived through both, he knows that slavery is a horrible thing that stems from wars, which are themselves horrible, and that both create monsters like Arnes's husband, or like himself. So it's partly thanks to this plot that Thorfinn's goal will also be to find a place where slaves no longer exist, in other words, where men are equal. These reflections will also lead him to wonder where this violence comes from, what its origins are, and while he won't necessarily find an answer to this far too complex question, he will nevertheless learn two things. The first is that, in the society in which he lives, fighting is a natural thing. War is so deeply rooted in society that it's almost impossible to change anything on a global scale, and the social pressure of Norse society regarding the warrior value of individuals is such that a man like Thorfinn will be ostracized from society, considered a weakling, a coward, and so the only thing Thorfinn can do on his own scale is to collect these individuals and take them with him to the Vinland. The second thing he retained is a paradox. The one that says that sometimes you have to fight if you want to protect peace, so you can legitimately wage war in the name of it, which is exactly what Knut does, and what Thorfinn for his part finds completely absurd, but we'll talk more about their opposition to this later. What's more, the weight of the dead weighs so heavily on Thorfinn's shoulders that it's physically impossible for him to kill even one more person. The solution to this problem is to leave with those people who, like him, are out of step with society and go far away, where no one can find them, to the other side of the horizon. And while this plot could have ended with a vengeance against Ketil, which would have been extremely cathartic for the reader in view of the horror of his act, Yukimura prefers to conclude with a monologue that I find just exceptional, when Thorfinn says, after Arnæs has breathed his last, far, far away to the west on the other side of the ocean there is a land called Vinland. There it's warm and the land is rich. It's a land so far away that slave traders and war have never reached it. There you can live without suffering. Arnæs, go there with us. Let's create a land of peace in Vinland. Everything about this scene is magnificent. The despair of Einar, who could do nothing despite all his love for Arnæs. The look on Leif Eriksson's face as Thorfinn repeats the legend he taught him as a child so long ago, showing him that he remembers it despite the passage of time, and that he has taken over from his father. And above all, the fact that this whole arc, and even the whole beginning of Vinland Saga, seems to have been written for this moment. It's at this point that we finally understand the true meaning of the manga's title. It's the Vinland Saga, the story of a group of people who set off in search of this famous land, in search of a place where man can live in peace. That's Vinland Saga, and in these pages lies the very essence of the manga. And you see, I'm stepping out of the analysis to tell you about my feelings, but it's for moments like these that I read manga, or even any other art form. It's for those moments when the author seems to be touched by grace, and manages to create that alchemy that makes his work touch me deeply, that I write these damn videos. And it's barely enough time to recover from this scene to find ourselves the next page with Einar on the verge of committing the irreparable, Thorfinn having to resort to violence to stop him from becoming like him. Through this ordeal, Einar came to understand Thorfinn. He understood the reasons why he became what he became, and how hard his commitment to non-violence is to keep. So, determined to follow him in his quest for Vinland, Einar decides to follow Thorfinn and becomes like a brother to him, and they promise each other to create this land of peace, without war or slavery across the sea in Vinland. But before leaving, Thorfinn has to face one last adversary, the King Knut. And since no one's going to let a louse like him pass, he's going to bet that he can take 100 punches from one of Knut's guards, so he can talk to him. This passage is truly iconic, as it shows Thorfinn's total resolve with regard to his new ideology. He could have forced his way in to see Knut, or even just made a few guards bite the dust to prove who he was, in other words resorting to violence to prevent greater violence, considering only the consequences of his actions and not his actions themselves. But no, because as he said, he would never choose the last resort. Like his father before him, he has become a true warrior, and it's only natural that he should conclude with the phrase he takes after his father, "I have no enemy." And this passage is all the more important as it comes in total opposition to Knut, with whom Thorfinn will have to negotiate immediately afterwards. In fact, the opposition between Thorfinn and Knut is quite simple to summarize. It's the opposition between two visions of morality. Consequentialist morality for Knut, that is a morality that judges the consequences of actions, not the actions themselves. Typically, we might consider that killing is wrong, but consider that it's our moral duty to kill a minority if it's to save the lives of a majority. And for Thorfinn, deontological morality, which consists in considering the action in itself, starting from the principle that guides it, and therefore, to continue with this example, never kill anyone, whatever the context, because it's fundamentally wrong. It's a rough summary, but that's about it. And so we're dealing with a philosophical opposition, an opposition that comes from the very basis of their thinking, which makes it fundamentally impossible to reach an agreement. Thorfinn doesn't want Nut to take Ketil's farm by force because it's wrong from his point of view, and Nut doesn't want to give up the farm even though he knows that taking it is wrong because giving it up would break a whole causal chain that would ultimately produce something good from his point of view. And yet Thorfinn's negotiation is successful, and Knut withdraws from the farm. But why? Well, there's a possible point of agreement between the consequentialist and the deontologist, called rule consequentialism. Indeed, a consequentialist like Knut will treat a deontologist like Thorfinn as naive, preventing himself from making the world a better place because he's blocked by his own principles. Typically, if Thorfinn found himself faced with a dilemma like the one on the trolley, where he had to choose between killing one person to save 5, or letting 5 people die, well, he'd probably choose to do nothing, whereas Knut would unhesitatingly sacrifice the innocent next. Basically, he has good intentions but is useless. However, what the consequentialist is obliged to admit is that if everyone were thoroughly deontological, well, he wouldn't have to get his hands dirty anymore. He wouldn't have to choose the lesser evil, or the last resort as Thorfinn says, provided of course that the deontologist's moral principles are in line with the consequentialist's ultimate goal. But that's why Knut can only admire Thorfinn, find him magnificent. Knut, growing up in the violence of Norwegian society, has a rather cynical view of human beings, believing that man cannot have strong moral convictions or else cannot hold on to them for very long. He lives in a world of all-out war, and that's why the only credible solution in his eyes is consequentialism, to turn this hell into paradise, as he puts it. But Thorfinn goes completely against all that, even though he's one of those Norsemen raised on violence. In short, Thorfinn shatters all his certainties and gives him a little hope, despite Knut's apparent incredulity at his words. That's why, when he leaves, abandoning the idea of taking over Ketil's farm, he says that today, he has gained a new companion. Another interesting point between Thorfinn and Knut is what each embodies in terms of Christian symbolism. During the arc, we see a rather interesting scene where Thorfinn listens to Serpent reading the Bible to the old man and finds it interesting, the biblical precepts being quite close in the end to the attitude Thorfinn is trying to have. It's funny because this scene shows us, with Knut in parallel, who wants to create a paradise on earth because he's angry at God for having abandoned them, that one is a believer, the other not so much, but that it's the non-believer who most respects the very foundations of the belief of the other. This opposition is all the more marked as Thorfinn seems to embody a new Christ-like figure, refusing violence and preferring love and dialogue to combat. What he wants to change is the hearts of men. As he triumphs over his adversary, suffering 100 blows in what resembles a martyrdom scene, he performs a miracle. Where everyone had been laughing, silence reigns, as the warriors are left speechless in the face of what seems to them to be a miracle. On the contrary, Knut is the opposite of Thorfinn and the Christ-like ideal. He's what we might call a Luciferian character. The Luciferian character originated in John Milton's Paradise Lost, a 16th century English epic poem. It depicts the fall of Satan and his demons into hell, and their attempt to corrupt mankind. The ambiguity of Milton's Satan lies in the empathy and charisma associated with this figure of evil. Later, with romantic literature, the Luciferian character, who can be associated with the figure of Prometheus, and the trickster in general, embodies revolt and the quest for freedom against a system deemed unjust and oppressive. Although his methods and actions are reprehensible, he is often a character who stands out for his ambiguity and flamboyance. Anyway, after all that, we get a little epilogue where Thorfinn and Einar bid farewell to the farm, where the farm seems to be doing better with a miserable Ketil and a more mature Ormar, detoxed from the warrior ideal, finally taking on his role as head of the family. On Knut's side, the absence of the riches taken from the farm and other farms he would probably have plundered afterwards will force him to withdraw his troops from England, which will ultimately have a much more positive effect than hoped, showing that in the end, his illogical choice at first, from his consequentialist point of view, was the choice leading to the best consequences, as a kind of proof of effectiveness of the rule consequentialism we were talking about earlier. And finally, Thorfinn and his group set off on their own to Iceland, to his native village, to see his mother and sister, whom he hadn't seen for 16 years now, and who were convinced he was dead. And after a reunion that's as funny as it is touching, he tells them everything that happened to him, all his crimes, explaining that those he killed all had a family, a history, that they weren't some kind of inanimate beings, as I said at the beginning of the video, and this subject will continue to be developed in the sequel. Then he explains his project to create a country of peace, where all these things won't happen again. And so begins the long quest for Vinland. Before concluding on a more personal note, I'd like to thank Majax, who helped me write this video by correcting me and adding stuff. If the writing of the video looks cleaner than usual, it's thanks to him. He's a philosophy teacher and the author of a 350-page analysis book on Attack on Titans, published by 3rd edition, which I'd highly recommend if you enjoy big, thorough analyses that include philosophy, as I sometimes do on a smaller scale on this channel. In short, when I first discovered Vinland Saga, it was via season 1 of the anime, and I liked it, but I wasn't too thrilled with it. I didn't really like the surrealism of certain scenes, and I found the story rather banal, especially as at the time I'd really had enough of medievalist stories of this type. I'd read quite a few and was a bit overdosed. So, even though I really liked the conclusion of season 1, and had noticed a few brilliant moments, I left Vinland Saga aside and didn't read the manga. Later I read Yukimura's previous manga Planets, which tells the story of people who, in a future where mankind is gradually beginning to colonize space, are sort of space garbage collectors, recovering space debris in orbit around the Earth. And I really found that brilliant. There was such a humanity about it that I couldn't imagine that the same person had drawn Vinland Saga. So I thought it might be worth reading Vinland Saga, especially as I was hearing really good feedback on the sequel and its radical change of atmosphere, even if it didn't seem to meet with unanimous approval. Rereading what corresponds to season 1, I already found it a bit better. I saw stuff I'd missed and all. And then I came across this arc and I was slapped in the face. Apart from the part where Thorfinn fights the morons who destroyed his field, and the fight with Serpent, Thorfinn didn't do anything spectacular. It was extremely frustrating to see him face up to all these forms of violence and only respond to them with passivity and good feelings. And for me, this is precisely one of the arc's greatest strengths, and probably even its most essential one. The farmhouse arc isn't fun to read because it's anti-cathartic. We're so used to seeing a badass, powerful, snarling Thorfinn, that to see him like this, amorphous, depressive, weakening little by little, well, in the logic of an action manga as it was from the start, it's frustrating, it's a waste in a way. But it's all the more relevant as it serves the purpose. Everyone agrees that violence is wrong and should never be used, but our emotions drive us to do just the opposite. If we get angry so often, it's because it's much nicer to vent our frustration on something or someone than to take it out on ourselves. To give up violence, as Thorfinn wants to do, you have to put aside these emotions, this tendency to react immediately and thoughtlessly, to go against your desires of the moment. And that's extremely frustrating, it's not pleasant, that's why it's so difficult. And that's why the farm arc is deliberately anti-cathartic, to make us understand how difficult it is to achieve Thorfinn's ideal of peace. It's not spectacular, hyping or pleasant, but it's absolutely essential. That's where Yukimura is really strong. In itself, the message he wishes to convey with his manga is distressingly banal. He's literally telling us that violence, war, and all that is wrong. Well, thank you, of course it's wrong, Mr. Yukimura, but who cares if the message is banal or not? You know, everything in art has already been told 1,000 times. In absolute terms, the famous "what does it say" isn't important. It's just the starting point of the reflection. In fact, it's the how it says it that really matters. And to see Yukimura use the very codes of storytelling to deceive us, to lull our empathy to sleep, and then turn it all around to wake us up with a big slap in the face, deconstructing all the mechanisms leading to violence, from the warrior ideal to patriarchy and social hierarchy. I think that's really brilliant. And it's all the more ingenious because this message is so out of step with the times we live in. We're going through a whole host of crises, climatic, economic, social, geopolitical, and so on. And all these crises are pushing people to become more cynical, more divisive, more extreme, and so on. And all it takes is a little interest in the social sciences to understand how crises make us more authoritarian, or at least more inclined to accept authoritarianism. And to bring out a manga like Vinland Saga with such a banal, positive, humanist message, while sacrificing its mainstream entertainment aspect and carrying so much hope in the end, is really completely out of step with our society and almost anti-conformist. Finally, the farm arc will begin to speak to us about the question of forgiveness and repentance. Is it possible for Thorfinn to be forgiven for his crimes? Is it morally acceptable for him to be? Is violence really wrong in any situation? Or does such thinking have limits? And what are they? Well, you'll find out in the rest of the manga, and I'm thinking, since this video covers the first part of Vinland Saga, that I'll do a video on the rest of the manga when it's finished, which shouldn't be too long now, to complete this one and give you a complete analysis of the manga. But even more than the question of forgiveness, Yukimura seems to answer a more fundamental question in this arc. Can men who have committed serious crimes like Thorfinn be given a second chance? In other words, can humans really change? This is an extremely complex and equally divisive question, as the answer would imply a whole host of positions on questions of societal organization, with of course the functioning of the justice system, and all the ensuing questions concerning the rehabilitation of criminals, the relevance of a justice system that is above all punitive, and so on. And once again, Yukimura goes in a direction that's anything but fashionable these days, telling us that yes, everyone can change. Far from excusing Thorfinn for his crimes and far from making his life a quiet and happy one, Because yes, we see that he suffers and will continue to suffer internally for the crimes he has committed. Perhaps for the rest of his life. He's going to make us understand that Thorfinn really has changed profoundly. That all men can change. And if man can change, categorizing an individual man as an enemy, that is as someone to whom we are fundamentally opposed and irreconcilable, makes absolutely no sense. That's why we don't have enemies. That's why nobody has an enemy.